Welcome, friends. You're watching Animal Quests. Today I'm presenting animals that evolved from ordinary predators into relentless serial killers. Some terrorized the same villages for years, while others discovered humans were the easiest prey of all. But first, let's begin with a crocodile believed to have devoured more than 300 people. It was September 2nd, 2023, in a narrow channel of Zambia's Luangwa Valley, and the attributed toll left behind by a single scarred bull crocodile the locals came to call Kanyemba had become 302 deaths across 11 years. To understand how one animal killed so many, you have to understand the valley itself. The Luangwa River is one of Africa's last major undammed rivers, home to tens of thousands of Nile crocodiles. Nearby communities rely on it daily for water, fishing, washing, and crossing between villages with no bridge for over 50 miles. Basically, you can't live here without entering the water daily. That dependency, layered onto one of the most crocodile-dense rivers on Earth, is the baseline risk every resident already accepted before Kanyemba was ever born. For most of his life, wildlife officers believe Kanyemba was an unremarkable apex predator. Nile crocodiles can live more than 70 years, and a 19-foot bull like him had likely spent decades ambushing prey along the Luangwa. He was simply another large, successful male among thousands. Then, sometime in early 2012, that changed. Rangers later believed a territorial clash with a hippo fractured the right side of his lower jaw, leaving the distinctive split scar across his snout that gave him his name. It's wild how one bad fight can completely change the course of an animal's life. The injury affected more than his appearance. A fractured lower jaw likely made larger prey harder to catch, leading wildlife officers to believe he gradually shifted toward easier targets, with repeated success at shallow crossings reinforcing the behavior. Over the following years, attacks clustered around one ferry crossing, prompting residents to avoid the area. Recovered victims showed injuries consistent with crocodile attacks, though no single injury pattern appeared in every case. You can almost feel the fear settling into everyday life long before anyone had answers. At first, rangers believed multiple crocodiles were responsible because the attacks were too numerous and spread across a long stretch of river. But repeated sightings of the same split-snouted bull near recent attack sites, sometimes feeding or lingering nearby, gradually convinced wildlife officers that one crocodile was likely responsible for many of the incidents. If I were one of those rangers, I honestly would have struggled to believe it was just one crocodile too. By 2023, villages along that stretch of river had effectively reorganized around him. Water collection happened in groups, at specific times, at specific spots, believed to be safer. Ferry operators watched the banks before letting passengers board, yet none of it was enough. In September of that year, Mwenya Kalaba, a 36-year-old school maintenance worker, crossed a narrow channel by canoe with his cousin, Luso Chaleshe, after the two had spent the morning repairing a village water pump. The crossing remained the shortest practical route between the villages they serviced. Luso stepped onto the muddy bank first. Mwenya stayed behind, knee-deep in the water, steadying the canoe. That was when the crocodile erupted from beneath him and clamped onto his upper thigh. One death roll was enough to cause catastrophic pelvic injuries before he was pulled under. Luso stood on the bank and watched the water boil with mud for several seconds before it went still. He didn't wait to see more. He ran straight to the ferry station where operators radioed authorities. Mwenya's body surfaced 3 days later, wedged beneath submerged tree roots downstream. Wildlife officers, as one park ranger later put it in a statement, had run out of reasons to call it coincidence. Kanyemba was formally declared a problem crocodile, and the department authorized repeated baited trap operations, patrol surveillance, and other targeted efforts to capture or remove him, a rare, resource-intensive designation reserved for animals with a documented, repeated pattern of human predation, but the traps never closed on him. Before any capture attempt succeeded, Kanyemba died naturally during the 2024 dry season from an overwhelming infection that officials believed may have been associated with long-standing damage to his old jaw injury, the same injury, they believe, that may have contributed to his repeated attacks on people in the first place. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no hunter's rifle, no crowd gathering to confirm the devil was dead. He simply disappeared from the river system he'd terrorized for over a decade, undone eventually by the same wound that had created him. It's tempting to villainize an animal responsible for 302 deaths, and I understand why the villages along the Luangwa called him what they did. But Kanyemba wasn't a monster. He was an old crocodile with a broken jaw, whose injury and repeated success at heavily used river crossings likely made people an increasingly common target. Kanyemba's shattered jaw finally gave out, where his victims never could, but silence in the water is nothing compared to a leopard's silence in the brush. It was a cool morning in February 12, 2017, along a fence line bordering South Africa's Kruger National Park. And the animal responsible for 44 confirmed deaths over roughly 15 years was about to claim her most consequential victim yet. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty, the setting mattered just as much as the animal itself. Kruger National Park spans nearly 2 million hectares, with its western boundary bordering rural communities in Mpumalanga and Limpopo. Flood damage, elephants, vandalism, and delayed repairs periodically open gaps in the boundary fence, allowing both wildlife and people to cross. Leopards, unlike lions, don't require open grassland. They thrive in exactly the mixed bushveld and mopane scrub that characterizes these border zones, often living within a few hundred yards of homesteads without anyone ever seeing them. I think that's what makes leopards so unsettling. You can be unbelievably close to one and never know it. Female leopards here typically live 12 to 15 years, holding home ranges of about 6 to 19 square miles. For most of her life, she likely hunted impala, bush pigs, and the occasional stray goat along familiar corridors, showing nothing out of the ordinary. According to ranger reports from 2002 through 2005, the shift appears to have been gradual. As advanced dental wear and broken canine teeth made healthy antelope harder to catch, investigators believe she increasingly stalked people along livestock trails near the park boundary. At first, she likely watched and followed without attacking, with each unpunished encounter gradually reducing her natural wariness. Leopards are ambush predators that rely on surprise and a powerful bite to quickly incapacitate prey. Investigators believe that once she learned solitary people moving predictably at dawn and dusk posed less risk than healthy antelope, she adapted. Instead of pursuing game, she began targeting people traveling alone before sunrise or after dark. The escalation followed a familiar pattern. Livestock losses came first, with goats and calves disappearing from outlying kraals through the early 2000s. Months later, isolated pedestrians began vanishing within a few hundred yards of dirt roads long used by local communities. Ranger Patrol reports repeatedly noted an unusually bold female leopard crossing roads in broad daylight. I can't really blame people for missing the warning signs at first, because they looked exactly like ordinary leopard problems. What concerned experienced rangers wasn't that she crossed during the day, but that she repeatedly lingered near people and ignored nearby vehicles, behavior considered a serious warning sign. By the early 2010s, some communities traveled in groups before dawn, but many still had no choice but to walk alone. After more than a decade patrolling the boundary, Senior Ranger Koos Verster believed the disappearances were linked to a single leopard. In February 2017, he and 28-year-old Ranger Assistant Mfo Sefala set out to inspect a damaged section of boundary fence, a routine job they'd done many times before. That was, in a sense, the point. By then, danger no longer announced itself. Mfo spotted fresh tracks near the fence and stepped a few yards into thick brush to photograph them, while Koos remained behind, providing armed overwatch. Moments later, Koos heard a single scream as the leopard burst from cover. She seized Mfo by the back of the neck, rapidly incapacitating him before dragging him into dense mopane scrub. Unable to take a safe shot without risking his colleague, Koos could only watch her disappear. Rangers recovered Mfo's partially consumed body later that afternoon beneath thorn bushes a few hundred yards away. Koos radioed Kruger operations immediately, and within days, authorities authorized lethal removal, a decision park officials don't make lightly, given leopard's protected status and ecological importance, but one that a ranger's daylight killing made unavoidable. When an animal loses its fear of us entirely in daylight, near infrastructure we depend on, sad to say, but there's no version of coexistence left to manage. Trackers with hounds picked up her trail within the week and cornered her in the branches of a marula tree not far from the fence line. A game warden ended it with a single rifle shot. Communities along the boundary reacted with exhausted relief. A necropsy, distinctive spot pattern, camera trap photos, tracks, and DNA confirmed she was the same leopard linked to the attacks for years. I don't think she was ever malicious, and I doubt she understood what she'd become. She was an old, capable predator who discovered, incident by incident, that the safest and most efficient prey available to her walked upright and alone at the edges of her territory. From the boundary paths of Kruger, where fear had quietly disappeared from one predator's mind, let's move to the tidal creeks of the Sundarbans, where an injured hunter learned to trade broken jaws for easier prey. It was May 22, 2017 in the Sundarbans, the tidal mangrove forest straddling India and Bangladesh, and a crab fisherman named Rakib Mullah was about to become the most famous victim of a killer. The Sundarbans, the world's largest mangrove forest, at about 3,860 square miles, is home to roughly 100 to 150 Bengal tigers. Around 500,000 people depend on fishing, honey collection, and wood gathering inside the forest, forcing daily overlap with tigers in a landscape where rising salinity and frequent cyclones continue shrinking space for both.
To me, that's one of the harshest realities out there, because neither the people nor the tigers can simply leave.
Just like the other predators, for most of his life, by every account rangers could piece together, our serial killer was a completely ordinary mature male Bengal. Forest officers first identified him not by aggression, but by a distinctive broken whisker pattern on his left side, along with his unique stripe pattern captured on camera traps, and a set of pug marks that repeated across multiple camera trap zones, evidence of an unusually wide range, even for a solitary tiger. Evidence gathered later, a fractured section of jaw and a missing upper canine, confirmed when the tiger was eventually examined, was consistent with severe blunt force trauma, though the exact cause could never be determined. The mechanics of the injury mattered enormously. A tiger's canines are what allow it to deliver the crushing bite that kills a deer or boar quickly. Without a full set, and with a compromised jaw, that kind of kill becomes difficult, sometimes impossible. Deprived of his usual prey, he needed something slower, something easier to overpower. Lone fishermen bent over crab traps in narrow tidal creeks fit that description exactly. The pattern escalated quickly once it started. Survivors across multiple incidents described the tiger appearing with almost no warning from the mangrove roots near active waterways. Victims vanished from canoes during the changing tide, when the water was shallow enough for the tiger to wade, but murky enough to hide him until the last second. Can you imagine being out there, working your butt off, and suddenly the water just explodes with a tiger? Villages on both sides of the border in Bangladesh's Shyamnagar and Satkhira districts, and across the line in India's south, 24 Parganas began reporting attacks with the same signature. It wasn't until rangers compared camera trap images of the tiger's stripe pattern, supported by pugmark records from both countries, that they realized they were tracking a single animal, one who had learned to treat an international border as nothing more than another stretch of water. The attack that made him infamous happened that May, when Rakib Mullah, 43, went out with his longtime partner Nayan Ghazi and another friend in a narrow wooden canoe to check crab lines. Without warning, the tiger launched from the exposed mangrove roots along the bank. One forepaw caught Rakib across the chest, throwing him backward into the waist-deep tidal water before he understood what had happened. He tried to get up. The friend said the tiger seized his throat first, then dragged him through the mud and into the mangroves. Nayan, still in the canoe, could hear choking, then branches snapping, and then nothing. Rakib's remains were recovered at the next low tide, the injuries to his neck consistent with a crushing bite, the body already showing signs of scavenging. Hearing your friend disappear like that and being powerless to help would stay with you forever. The Bangladesh and Indian authorities shared identification records and coordinated their efforts, while wildlife officers on the side of the border where the tiger was located prepared the operation. Forest officers who had tracked man-eating tigers before set conditions for the operation, the tiger had to be identified beyond doubt before any lethal action was authorized. For nearly 2 weeks, they tracked him through the mangroves, following pug marks that vanished and reappeared with each tide, until they finally located him, feeding on bait laid along a known travel corridor. The tranquilizer dart found its mark, but the tiger didn't go down quietly. Before the sedative took hold, he charged the team, closing the distance in seconds, and a ranger with no time left to wait fired, killing him in self-defense just yards from where the team stood.
As one Bangladesh Forest Department officer put it afterward, "We didn't kill a monster. We removed an animal that could no longer live the way tigers are supposed to live."
The tragedy belongs as much to the mangroves themselves as to the tiger that couldn't survive them any other way. As if that's not scary enough, let's head north to the Alaskan interior, where a bullet didn't end a grizzly's rampage, it started one. It was April 2, 2022, in a stand of dense alder beside a nameless creek in Alaska's interior, and behind it lay a toll that wildlife officials would eventually attribute to a single animal. 31 confirmed deaths across 12 years. A bear that could cover hundreds of miles had the perfect conditions to stay hidden. Interior Alaska's remote hunting camps, limited communication, and inconsistent food storage created repeated opportunities for conflict, especially in a region with some of North America's highest grizzly densities. Many of the eventual victims were alone in remote country, and several were initially listed as missing before later discoveries of remains confirmed bear predation.
I can't help but feel like they practically set the dinner table for this monster with every careless granola bar left in a tent.
The bear, later identified by a torn ear and pale shoulder scar, was likely just another large male grizzly. Wildlife officials believe he spent years moving between food sources and avoiding people, with occasional camp raids driven by hunger rather than aggression. But see, that just another bear narrative is exactly why they sleepwalked right into this tragedy. Around 2019, investigators believe he survived a gunshot wound, likely from a hunter defending a camp that left him with a permanent limp. The injury mattered less for the pain than for what it cost him physically. A compromised hind leg meant reduced endurance, diminished mobility over rough ground, and less ability to compete for natural food sources, and biologists believe it may have shifted his risk calculus entirely. Fleeing became harder. Standing his ground or escalating instead of retreating may have simply become the more successful strategy. The shift showed up gradually, and, confusingly, because of geography. Attacks were reported across connected interior watersheds from the northern foothills of the Alaska Range through portions of the Tanana and Yukon drainages, and for a long time investigators assumed multiple bears responsible. Since no single grizzly was believed responsible for every incident,
Nobody wants to believe that one dude is responsible for a decade-long crime spree across that much wilderness.
hunters described tents torn apart even after food had already been packed out, which didn't fit typical raiding behavior. Several abandoned camps were found with blood but almost no remains, which fit something worse. Other victims were not discovered for months, while some disappearances remained unexplained until later searches recovered enough remains to confirm bear predation. It wasn't until DNA sampling from hair and saliva at multiple sites was cross-referenced with tissue samples and photographs collected when the bear had been captured during a research project years earlier that officers connected years of scattered violence to the same previously collared bear. The fact that it took DNA to connect these dots makes me furious at the system, not the bear we had the data sitting in a fridge somewhere for years. By early 2022, hunting guides across the interior were quietly rerouting clients away from certain drainages. Word traveled through outfitter networks the way it does in small, isolated professions informally, urgently, incompletely. Camps doubled up on firearms. However, it would do nothing to stop the tragedy that was about to happen. That April, brothers Jalen and Eli Lopez set up a temporary moose camp beside a small creek, splitting the routine chores of a multi-day hunt. Eli walked a short distance to gather firewood, while Jalen started dinner near the tent. The bear came out of the alder from only a few yards away, close enough that there was no meaningful reaction window. One swipe put Eli on the ground. The bites that followed were fast and catastrophic. Jalen fired several rounds in the chaos, none effective enough to turn the charge, and scrambled onto a stack of fuel drums as the bear dragged his brother into the brush and vanished. Search teams later recovered scattered remains roughly 150 yards from the campsite.
It's scary to know that when an animal stops running from gunfire, that's not aggression. That's an animal that has learned that gunfire doesn't even reliably stop it.
Wildlife officers tracked the bear for weeks via field evidence and archived records, finding him at a winter-killed moose carcass he'd revisited. As they moved in for the planned lethal removal, he charged. They shot him within seconds, the confrontation lasting barely longer than the one that killed Eli Lopez. There was no ceremony at the site, no crowd, just a small team confirming through the collar data and the scars that this was, in fact, the animal responsible for years of scattered deaths across a landscape most people never connected. Looking back at all those years, all those victims, this wasn't a rogue bear, it was a mirror reflecting our own complacency in the wild. A grizzly who learned that guns couldn't stop him was terrifying enough on land, but in the murky waters of the Congo, an even larger predator was proving that territory means more than any human life crossing it. It was August of 2022 on Lake Edward. For 9 years, the waters had belonged to one animal. What was it about that morning that made the cousins think the rules had changed? To hold territory on Lake Edward, a bull hippo doesn't need to be the strongest, it just needs the people on the shore to have no backup. Virunga National Park, on paper, provides that backup rangers, protocols, removal teams, but on the ground, the park has been crippled since the Second Congo War. Its rangers underpaid, undertrained, and frequently killed by poachers and militias.
What's the point of a protected park if the protectors are basically sacrificial pawns? That's just infuriating for me.
The authorities that managed the park had reports on the aggressive bull as early as 2019. They had no security to act on them. So when a hippo, which was later named Chuma, flipped a canoe for the first time somewhere around 2016 and discovered that the splash didn't bring any consequences, he kept flipping. For 9 years, there was no one to tell Chuma no. They gave a 3-ton tank a free pass for nearly a decade, and honestly, can you blame the bull for taking it? Additionally, fishing communities along the shoreline, meanwhile, depended on the lake for survival. An estimated 50,000 people fish these waters, many without permits, using dugout canoes barely wider than a man's shoulders. Regional instability didn't just fail to stop Chuma, it created the conditions that let him operate, uninterrupted, for nearly a decade. Hippos are naturally territorial along a defended stretch of shoreline, and Chuma's stretch happened to be roughly 2 miles of prime fishing water near the village of Kiavinyong. At first, he behaved the way territorial hippos always do, grunting warnings, mock charges, the occasional close call, nothing that hadn't happened for generations. And honestly, I'd be grumpy too if my living room doubled as a canoe highway. The turning point, according to local fishermen, came sometime around 2016, when a canoe carrying 2 men strayed too close to a submerged sandbank Chuma used as a resting spot. Hippos are ambush-capable animals, despite their bulk. They can move at nearly 19 miles per hour on land and can launch upward from the lakebed with tremendous force, flipping a canoe entirely. They basically trained him to be a flipping machine through their own inaction. Once a hippo successfully capsizes a boat and either injures or kills an occupant, it may respond the same way during later encounters with canoes entering the same territory, repeating an aggressive territorial response rather than developing predatory behavior toward people. From that point forward, Chuma didn't just defend his territory. He aggressively attacked nearly every canoe that entered it. What followed was a slow, grinding escalation. Entire villages quietly relocated their launch sites farther down the shoreline, sometimes adding hours to a fishing trip that used to take minutes. Search parties routinely found boats split cleanly in half, paddles floating with no bodies attached. Local fishermen began referring to a rough boundary that younger men were warned never to cross alone. Wildlife officials in Kinshasa acknowledged the pattern as early as 2019, but as one ranger later told a regional radio station, they had the reports. What they did not have is the security to act on them. Ongoing conflict in the surrounding hills made any sustained operation against a single hippo a low priority against a backdrop of much larger human tragedies. In August 2022, Chuma attacked a group where Toma Kivira was in. The group were checking nets before sunrise when Chuma surfaced directly beneath their dugout. The impact launched all 5 men into the water instantly. They swam hard for a bed of floating reeds. All 4 made it. Toma did not. Witnesses on shore, alerted by the commotion, watched helplessly as the hippo lifted Toma's body and slammed it against the wreckage of the canoe, repeating the motion until the boat splintered into pieces. Chuma continued circling the wreckage for several minutes afterward, behavior consistent with territorial aggression rather than simple predation, though the distinction mattered little to the family waiting on shore. Conservation officials floated the idea of a targeted removal operation, but the same instability that had allowed Chuma to operate for nearly a decade made it just as difficult to end things on human terms. No successful removal was ever mounted. In the end, it wasn't a bullet or a trap that closed the account. In late 2023, fishermen found Chuma's body floating near the same stretch of shoreline he'd defended for years, marked by deep bite wounds consistent with a fatal fight against another bull hippo.
It horrifies me that the same kind of territorial violence that may have shaped him in the first place was also what ultimately ended his life.
Meanwhile, the next predator on our list didn't need a temper, only decades of conditioning that taught him humans meant an easy meal. It was June 13, 2019. On the Blackwater channels near Novo Airão in Brazil's Amazonas state the moment a caiman finally caught up with its own body count. The Rio Negro had spent 18 years teaching a bull-black caiman to see humans as prey, and on that morning, his final lesson was about to begin. The Brazilian Amazon had spent decades quietly building the conditions for something like this. After black caimans were hunted to near collapse for their hides through the mid-20th century, conservation efforts allowed their populations to rebound into the hundreds of thousands across the basin, especially in protected blackwater habitats. As tourism, fishing, and river traffic expanded over the following decades, remote waterways saw more people, more discarded fish waste, and more caimans sharing the same narrow channels than ever before. And then one bull caiman among thousands grew slowly in the tannin-dark water south of Novo Around. Fishermen who'd worked those channels since the 1990s remembered him as a curiosity, not a threat. A big male, distinctive for a deeply notched tail, scarred in some territorial fight, who'd cruise past river ports at dusk. He wasn't born dangerous, he was made that way. For years, fishermen and camp owners tossed him fish carcasses and bait scraps off the dock, the kind of casual, illegal feeding that state wildlife agents had warned about since the 80s. Mechanically, it's simple. Caimans are ambush predators, driven more by conditioned feeding behavior than by recognizing individual people. Once boats and boots at the water's edge meant food was coming, he stopped waiting to be fed and started closing the distance himself.
Classic case of a fed caiman is a dead caiman, except this time, we're the ones who ended up dead.
Then, sometime around 2004, he lost his left eye. Biologists suspect a propeller strike or a fight with another bull, and something changed. With vision reduced on one side, he likely relied more heavily on water movement and close-range ambushes. The attacks started scattered across a wide stretch of Blackwater, the main channel of the Rio Negro and the flooded forest passages threading through the Anavilhanas Islands. Because the geography was so spread out, wildlife investigators spent years assuming they were dealing with several large caimans, not one. River ports became the deadliest places in the region. People disappeared while freeing boats, retrieving gear, or working at the water's edge moments when they were distracted and most vulnerable. Over the years, authorities documented dozens of attacks along the Rio Negro. As survivor accounts, distinctive wounds, and repeated sightings accumulated, investigators concluded that many of the confirmed attacks were likely the work of the same large bull caiman.
Can you imagine living on those channels knowing any splash could be your last? I wouldn't last a night out there.
The most notorious attack came on a clear June morning in 2019. Darlin Souza, a 47-year-old commercial fisherman, backed his aluminum skiff down the launch at first light while his friend Kawan Lima parked the truck. Darlin stepped into calf-deep water to unhook the trailer strap, a task he'd done thousands of times. The caiman surged up from beneath the surface without warning and clamped onto his leg. A death roll tore him off his feet and dragged him toward the channel. Kawan sprinted down the bank in time to see Darlan's head break the surface once, screaming, before the water closed over him again. He never resurfaced. Search teams recovered Darlan's body the next day, tangled beneath submerged, flooded forest roots less than 150 feet from where he'd been standing.
That's the kind of gut punch that haunts you forever.
Wildlife officials, under mounting pressure from grieving families and a furious fishing community, brought in a government-licensed wildlife handler with over 20 years' experience removing problem animals from working waterways. The end came on a humid afternoon in late July. Using heavy baited hooks rigged to steel cables anchored near a known feeding spot, the handler's team finally hooked something that didn't fight like anything they'd handled before. It took 4 men and 2 boats nearly 2 hours to bring him alongside the dock. The notched tail and missing left eye confirmed it instantly, and the animal's scars and distinctive injuries matched years of survivor descriptions and photographs collected during the investigation, strengthening officials' conclusion that they had finally removed the same problem caiman. Families who'd lost husbands, sons, and friends over 18 years finally had a name or at least a face to attach to their grief. Fishermen who'd feared certain launches for years began using them again.
I believe it's no hot take to say that nature didn't create this danger. People did, one thrown fish carcass at a time.
And it took 18 years and 30 deaths attributed to the animal, with 18 confirmed and the remainder considered probable, to undo what years of kindness had built.